started and let me share the screen. What we'll do today is we will first introduce a puzzle that helps us to clarify some of the issues involved in critiquing countries and government policy from the vantage point of human development. And then we'll move to the politics that I just talked about a moment ago. And we'll eventually begin to define political economy. This is the part of our focus in this course that so far we actually haven't addressed. And as you'll see, it ties together these different components really nicely. So thank you for being here, and let's get started. So before we set up a puzzle that we'll return to as we go through the course, we'll introduce one more indicator that we would classify as an economic indicator, or one part of the dimension of economic development, and that is gross national income, or GNI per capita. And this is basically the total domestic and foreign output by residents of a country. That is, it consists of GDP and factor incomes earned by foreign residents minus income earned in the domestic economy by non-residents. And what I should have added here is divided by population. And so those of you who are taking notes or who want to have a complete portrait of this, add that this is divided by population, moreover. So it's one more way of looking at income and income levels. It's similar, obviously, to GDP per capita. And you'll see that many of the richest countries from this lens or this vantage point are the same countries that appear in the top 5 list for GDP per capita. But the reason that I want to introduce this to you is because of the puzzle that I want to present to you next. And remember that when we use these indicators, we want to think about country experiences critically and use them for purposes that are productive and analytical. They don't just exist in a vacuum. We use them as a set of tools in real problem solving. And so the first empirical puzzle that we'll really introduce in this class is the following. Colombia and Venezuela, 2 countries in the Andes in South America. You can see them here from a long sort of vantage point. And then up close, a political map shows them here. Their capitals are far apart, but they otherwise have similar geography, similar colonial experiences, or they share a similar colonial legacy with Spain. They had independence at the same time, and they developed their political and their economic institutions in a very similar way. In fact, during the 20th century, they were both examples of very stable democracies, and very prosperous ones at that. Venezuela was even more prosperous than was Colombia. But the puzzle that I want to present to you is the following. Using GNI per capita, the GNI per capita for Colombia in 2019 was US about $15,000. So the income per person was about $15,000. Venezuela's was about $17,000. Now, these are just for comparative purposes. Obviously, inflation and other indicators in Venezuela totally changed the situation. But for comparative purposes, these are the GNI per capita incomes in those countries in that year. But the puzzle begins to emerge when you consider their human development outcomes. Despite having a lower income per capita or per person income, Colombia had a higher HDI value, or human development index value. Remember that takes into consideration those 3 different components, including income, but also education rates and then mortality rates, considerably higher in Colombia, 0.767 on a scale from 0 to 1, 1 being the most developed. Venezuela, by contrast, 0.711. Now, they're both categorized technically as more developed or more humanly developed countries, but Venezuela is at the very bottom of that list. And moreover, the trend in Venezuela is a sharp decrease, while in Colombia, it's steadily growing and increasing. And so the puzzle is, why is it that a poorer country, technically speaking, Colombia, has a much higher human development index? And when you consider, moreover, that GNI per capita is already part of HDI, Venezuela's real or sort of actual social development is likely to be much, much lower than even what appears in this number here. And so this is a puzzle. It's an interesting puzzle. And it could be a basis for critiquing government policy in Venezuela, or for rewarding or analyzing or evaluating favorably or learning from government policy in Colombia. Of course, these are relative differences. So it might be the case that overall, Colombia could learn a great deal from Uruguay or Costa Rica or so on. But in terms of this comparison, it's instructive because we can then use these differences in this pattern, this kind of strange puzzle, to then assess and analyze the origins and the factors that might account for the difference. And that's where we begin to connect theory to practice. You can think about what policies are working well in Colombia, what policies are not working well in Venezuela. This is one puzzle that we could look at and consider and use to learn from. We could use our indicators in a productive way. We can critique policy and generate hypotheses. We could even create a set of conclusions that might figure in some development practice or report if we were, say, officials or analysts or working in some capacity in the international development community. This brings us to the third dimension of development, and really the one that so far I've portrayed as sort of the most forgotten of the three. Now, to be clear, it's understood that politics matters. It's just that on a systematic level, the political dimension has been less incorporated in the discussion. And this is one of the strange curiosities and paradoxes of the development discourse. In this class, we'll treat politics as not only an equivalent part of development, but possibly the most important part, because we'll be focusing on the political economy of development. So in some ways, we'll be focusing on political outcomes as well as political causes in our analysis of the economy in development. But when we talk about political development, we really mean, frankly, democratic advances, or more specifically, civil rights and political liberties that create opportunities for participation in politics, equivalent and pluralistic participation, values and institutions or settings that are inclusive and encompassing, that are consensual perhaps, or that stimulate cooperation and produce decision making and outcomes that represent the desires and the preferences of the public, who themselves should be able to perhaps have property rights and be able to move freely, be able to exercise the right to speak and to favor or oppose policies and structures and so on and so forth. It's an exhaustive list, as I know you could probably imagine. For now, we'll put this under civil rights and political liberties, the key rights and liberties that individuals need to have in order to be able to be said to have the capabilities that are necessary to develop themselves and to participate productively in the economy and in society and in politics. So this is very abstract, I realize it, but this will create the framework for the rest of the course. And you'll see in a moment that when we get into political economy and defining that conceptually and as a lens, we'll get into some more specific conceptual examples of what we mean when we talk about the political factors that become important. But for now, what we can say is that when we incorporate the political dimension, development becomes something totally new and different and more encompassing. And really, it becomes growth, social progress, and democratic advances as development. And this is a more sophisticated and nuanced and multi-dimensional view of development that even many of the most sort of unorthodox thinkers in economics have not had. This incorporation of the political dimension is something that will be familiar to us in political science, but is certainly something that highlights the multidimensional nature of development as a process experienced by an individual in society. So political development, what we can say then is that improving the quality of people's lives and their access to resources and opportunities depends on the decisions that society makes. And societies choose, they make choices about the allocation and distribution of scarce resources. All societies make choices. They set up institutions and systems for regulating and ordering that process. Those choices are just as important as the policy choices that they make once they elect or anoint leaders who act on their behalf. These processes matter greatly to the experience of the individual and the dignity that we can associate with their life. Is it a dignified life? Well, much of that is political as well as societal and social and economic. And so it also depends on who makes those decisions. It's not just the rules and the setup in the decisions themselves, but also who is making them. Then we begin to consider questions about representation, descriptive representation, and the way that we elect leaders and the link between leaders and voters or participants or citizens in society. What we're getting at is the politics of development. Of course, we'll define politics differently in a moment, but decisions and choices among different possible choices, the election or the anointing of leaders to act on the behalf of citizens, leaders using authority vested in them to make decisions about what will be available to or not available to citizens in that society. This is certainly political. It seems so obvious that it probably seems redundant to many of you. You might be saying, this seems just very, very um, generic and obvious. And it is obvious to some degree. But what's interesting is that it's one of the contradictions of international development. This is an academic and political and practical discourse that's often been led by economists to some degree, others working in applied fields, less often by political scientists who've been part of the discussion, but whose voices have often played a less important role when we consider that Sen himself was an economist. And that discussion, framed by economists, gave the political dimension of development less attention. Now, there are important exceptions. Douglas North, who wrote about the importance of political and economic institutions in development, in impeding or promoting development. Other economists who did discuss the role of political institutions, but even the politics is often missing in those accounts of the political institutions and their role in development. And so what we'll do in this class is we'll begin to discuss the political economy and the politics of development and economic policy in developing countries. Before we get to our introduction of political economy, it's useful to look at something like this, which is basically a representation of rights and freedoms or rights and liberties, civil rights and political liberties around the world. Now, this is the Freedom House Index. This is an index commonly used in comparative politics to categorize regimes and evaluate sometimes the outcomes or the quality of democracy in a country. They have a relatively uh, encompassing set of measures that they use that range from all sorts of civil liberties and rights to the behavior of the government, positive rights and negative rights. We won't get into what that means, but it's a long list. And with that set, that list, and those evaluations and those scores that are assigned in those different categories on that list, they give one of three labels to a country. A country is either not free, it's an authoritarian regime with all of the institutional and other systematic features that are characteristic of that. And usually that involves intense repression and limited rights and liberties. And in general, a less prosperous politically place in the sense that political development means rights and liberties and democratic advances. A partly free society is one that's sort of like a mixed hybrid or sort of a part democratic, part authoritarian model, where it might be possible to exercise important rights and liberties, but where there might be limitations or restrictions in key areas. It may be difficult to unseat the incumbent government. We could identify a lot of limitations or imperfections that would take a country from a full democracy or even improvements that would take a country from a full authoritarian regime to sort of a mixed hybrid type, which is here represented with orange. Of course, the green, that category is countries that are categorized as free according to the scores in the different civil rights and liberties that are enjoyed by citizens in that country in a given year. So with these political indicators, we can look at countries from the vantage point of the rights and liberties enjoyed by citizens and to what extent they live lives of dignity from the vantage point of politics and participation and meaningful participation in politics through expression and the exercise of rights and liberties. This is, of course, a new dimension, and it's one that is often far less sort of visible in the development programs of the international community. And oftentimes, of course, it's governments who seem to care the most about regime type, but often for their own self-interested reasons. And I mean to say that other governments will often care about regime type in other countries, but for self-interested reasons. But the organizations and NGOs and non-governmental organizations and analysts and development entrepreneurs who work to promote development are often looking at issues from a more strictly economic and social vantage point. Even the Human Development Index in the UN often seems to focus on some of those characteristics more. And so in this class, we're thinking about development as both in simultaneously economic and social and political. And this is what we mean when we say we mean political development, rights and liberties. Now, at this stage, you might be asking, so what actually is political economy, and what do we mean when we say political economy? And is it a field of study, or is it a thing that exists that we're examining? Is it a way of giving advice to political leaders about economic issues? All three of these have actually been invoked to give meaning to the term political economy. In this course, we'll be thinking about political economy as both a thing, but also a sort of way of understanding, or a lens, or kind of a method. And you'll see in a moment what we mean, but let's begin to sort of unfurl this piece by piece. And we'll start off with a quote, which I think is an excellent quote for this part of the course. And give me a moment here. I need to take a swig of coffee and some water. I've got a headache today. I don't know if the coffee helps, but they say that a little bit of caffeine always helps as long as you're drinking water. Anyway, so the quote is, economists must not only know their economic models, but also understand politics, interests, conflicts, passions, the essence of collective life. For a brief period of time, you could make changes by decree, but to let them persist, you have to build coalitions and bring people around. You have to be a politician. And this is such a beautiful quote, which is by Alejandro Foxley, the former Chilean Minister of Finance, because it highlights the link between the economy and politics by identifying the role of interests and conflicts in those benefits or those relationships that seem to connect different players to the economy and to politics, and the different coalitional possibilities that emerge with that diverse set of interests and passions. And this, in a nutshell, is what political economy is. It has to do with the relationship between political and economic forces within a society. It has to do with the formation of interests through the establishment of relationships in the economy, and then the formation of coalitions on top of those interests, and then the lobbying or the winning of government by those coalitions, and then the recreation of the rules of the economy by those coalitions or their maintenance. These interests and coalitions and power relations are indispensable to any political economy analysis. And the way we'll analyze the economy and the way we'll analyze policies will involve many of the tools that come from economic analysis combined with the tools from political analysis. And this begins to introduce our next part of this introductory unit. And this is where we begin to conceptualize political economy, and we think about what they are individually and what they mean when we put them together. And bear with us here because this is a very abstract way of beginning, but the foundation is important. And for us to think about political economy in a critical way, we need to have a clear conceptual lens to examine the problems that we'll examine in the course and that we've already begun to introduce. So on the one hand, in the realm of politics, we think about authority and coercion and the power of the state and legitimacy and the capacity to set up institutions or organizations with that power of the state or vested with authority and more or less legitimate and which are official and which can make policy or pursue or create particular kinds of political or economic institutions in pursuit of certain kinds of social objectives. We think of the darkness of authoritarian regimes and we think of the light of democratic transitions. We think of all of the manifold diversity of political institutions, but we above all think about an interaction with power and overpower. And power is that elusive property which seems to be anywhere and everywhere, but nowhere simultaneously. But it above all means the capacity to affect outcomes and to bring about change, and often to do so against and despite great opposition. On the other hand, economics is not imbued with that same passion and that same coercion or that same incitement to legitimacy or that same sort of expression. It's the sterile sort of dismal science. It's how people interact with and overvalue. It's concerned with calculation and shrewd, informed analysis that is, separate from political heat and debate and controversy. It's sterile and isolated and insulated. It's in a vacuum, right? It's decisions made in rooms, around conference tables, about numbers that move. It's very separate. It seems to be disconnected. It doesn't seem to be at all similar to politics. They are both social sciences and they are both examples of social behavior, but they seem to have a different kind of origin or root or nature. And what I want to establish is that they're not as separate as we think, and that they in fact interact. And in this course, we'll look at how they interact and how their interaction becomes very consequential for development. And this interaction is magnificent because it captures the interests and the power relations, the intensity of the debate and the controversy, the conflict, but it also captures the calculations and the information and the decision making of the agent and their autonomy or their capacity to behave as fully informed, fully inspired, but level-headed and rational decision makers. This is a marriage of the logic of instrumentality and the logic of authority. And it's a marriage that is not a difficult one. In fact, interestingly, economics began as political economy because it was understood as inseparable from government. The laws of production and trade and the distribution of income were understood as only understood in a context that was connected to government, because the sanction of government was what created the market and created, in particular, the law and the legal foundation for all of those means of exchange. Now, gradually, economics tried to sort of shackle itself and establish itself as a true, dismal, sterile, cold science. And it very, very forcefully kind of removed all of that political sort of, I guess, residue, if you will. And what we're left with today is representations like this, which strike the heart as in fact, very separate and sterile and very shrewd and calculating and different than the kind of authority and power infused in a picture like this. Now, economics, as I've so far described it, is really the study of how, in the activity through which people produce, distribute, and consume scarce resources. It begins with the assumption that we only have so much to go around and that we behave and pursue and do things to produce and distribute and consume those scarce resources. And these economic relationships that we develop and that we cultivate in our behavior is understood as rational and calculating. We're behaving in a way so that we maximize our benefits and minimize our costs. Everything has a price, but there are also potential benefits that might justify actions and decisions. Economics is concerned with rational human behavior over and around value in the consumption, distribution, and production of scarce resources. Politics is the activity through which people make, preserve, and amend the general rules under which they live. It is that power struggle, that conflict, that tension, that collision of forces over and around the creation, maintenance, and change and cultivation of the rules under which they live, and that will determine who and how decisions are made and who is making those decisions. Economics concerns itself with how people interact over value. Politics concerns itself with how people interact over power. Power and value are two separate things, without a doubt. But power can also shape the processes and the institutions and the rules around the creation and the distribution of those scarce resources. And therefore, power does interact with value, even though they are separate. The political economy perspective, in our perspective, as we embark, is that power and value are inseparable and that they feed on each other. And more specifically, as we'll see, they create and recreate each other. And that feedback type relationship is what often drives the long patterns of development that we have witnessed so far over the period of centuries. We saw that in the video with Rosling, and we've seen that with visualization since. But more to the point, politics within countries concerns itself with political actors like presidents and prime ministers. It concerns itself with political machinery like parties and coalitions. It concerns itself with policies like economic policy or health policy, military policy. And it concerns itself with state institutions like regime type of democracy, legislative power and executive power, legislative and executive relations. You'll see a consistent theme here, which is that all of these institutions or actors or things are related to power in some way. They either wield it or exercise it, or they result from its use. They are engaged in the creation or the cultivation of powerful coalitions. Sorry, I don't know if you saw that. He was unable to join the meeting. He's going to have to join a different way. Politics has us concerned with these issues. Economics, on the other hand, has us concerned with households and firms and buyers and sellers. It concerns itself with fiscal policy and monetary policy. It concerns itself with institutions as well, like property rights and banking systems. But what you'll notice is that there's an overlap here. Does anyone notice the overlap between these two descriptions? Yeah, so they both study public policies. That's important because that means that despite the effort of economists to distinguish themselves from political scientists and to kind of throw off the shackles of politics and that residue of politics, they're studying a lot of the same things. And in fact, the focus on public policy is perhaps the most important focus in political economy research because the policies that result from the processes that take place within institutional frameworks have very important consequences. And so there's a focus on those policies and how they get created or why they're created, their consequences. Economists care about that perhaps more than political scientists. But to the extent that political scientists focus on policies as well, we both have a lot to learn from each other. What's beautiful about political economy is that it marries these two umbrellas and these two, focuses. Foci, is that a word? Political economy, we can actually define it as the analysis of the interaction between political and economic processes within a society. Those political actors, institutions, systems, they interact with economic policies and systems and outcomes in institutions and actors. And the interaction is an important continual interaction. It's a constant, perpetual process where actors try to alter the distribution of power and wealth between themselves and their rivals in their favor. They're trying to alter the distribution of power and wealth between groups and individuals within society. The actors and the players in question might differ and do differ for every different actor, but they're all engaged in this constant, continual struggle. This is the essence of political economy. It's both the analysis of that interaction as well as the constant struggle to alter the distribution of power and wealth between actors in society. And this definition plays on and incorporates the rational actor methodology and perspective, but it also incorporates the focus on the pursuit of power and self-interest that is characteristic of politics. So we're bringing politics and economics closer together, and we're sort of dispensing with the idea that they are so distinct that they can't be productively used under the same umbrella. And in practice and in theory, from our vantage point, actors shape and are shaped by the political processes that create, sustain, and transform these relationships over time. There is an intimate link between politics and economics. One shapes the other, and the other reshapes the other reshapes the other, and so on and so forth. And the critical implication for development, understood as social, political, and economic, is that these actors, systems, and institutions, in the process of struggling for power and wealth, either promote or impede development. So this constant struggle is going on just all the time. And that struggle creates consequences for development. The institutions and the actors and the systems characteristic of that particular struggle are going to bear heavily on the development outcome in a given country. And so we focus then on that interaction between political and economic processes. We focus on the motivations of the actors. We focus on the institutions, the system. We focus on the way that the actors struggle to alter the distribution of power and wealth, and to what degree different actors succeed in doing so. This is an approach that dignifies both the economic and the political perspectives, and it doesn't concede that they are separate. In fact, it argues something very different, that they are, in fact, intimately linked and cannot be understood as individual and separate things. Now, this is very theoretical. And this is very, very abstract. But this is a framework that sets us up to very, very usefully analyze development and how development can be a product of a variety of different factors that might fall under this umbrella or label of political economy. Now, I want to pause and I want to begin to sit back a moment and I want to open it up and have a discussion with you about development, but from the perspective of political economy. And I think that a useful way of doing this is to think about our puzzle, Colombia and Venezuela. From a political economy perspective, what kinds of things might we look at to try to figure out why Colombia is more developed than Venezuela, despite having an income per capita that is actually lower? What would a political economy perspective suggest we should look at or examine in those respective cases to try to understand that variation? Max says the leadership in Venezuela. Good. William says actors. Let's be a little more specific. Certainly actors. And I think that leadership is a good place to start. What else, or what kinds of leaders, or who else would be important in this respect? Ernie says hyperinflation. So certainly the policies, right?
Would it be like institutions, right, that are affecting all of these public policies, right? Like in Venezuela, like their institutions are falling apart.
Yeah,
Um,
totally. Can you think of any examples, Max?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, please?
Sorry, can you think of any examples of some of the institutions that are in decline in Venezuela?
Well, I know they're having an issue with all of their oil, so I think their foreign policies. I'm not too sure at the exact moment, but in the news, you can see that they're having issues with their economy. I think it would be like their bank, national bank, unable to afford all of their debts.
Yeah, so there are so many problems in Venezuela. And, one issue is they've had a failed monetary policy. They've also had some serious deficiencies and failures in other areas of economic policy. So one big problem is price fixing has resulted in shortages. You see in the news these supermarkets in Venezuela that are empty. Why are they empty? Well, because the government sets prices. They set a certain price for basic consumer goods. And if the production cost of producing those goods goes over the price fixed by the government, the producers of those goods just don't produce them. And so people go without basic items. That's a failed policy. In Colombia, there's no such thing as that. No such thing as that. And you can, of course, critique the leadership in Colombia and critique many of the policies in Colombia. But that sort of deficiency is not evident. But this is an example of how we can critique a policy, a very specific policy, and we can identify it as a potential source of some of these shortcomings in Venezuela. And hyperinflation is certainly also a result of that failed monetary policy, and as well as many other problems in Venezuela. Walter says government and illegal trade relations history in Colombia. So I think in this case, well, that's an interesting angle to think about Colombia. And while we're not necessarily saying that Colombia has everything put together, we might need to identify, something about Colombia that we could perceive as a strength, right? If we're differentiating it from Venezuela and we want to try to explain, well, what worked in Colombia that did not work in Venezuela, or what didn't work in Venezuela that worked in Colombia, from the perspective of our critique of Venezuela so far, we could say that Well, the absence of price fixing or the absence of an experimental monetary policy in Colombia has meant that the social development has been less uh, constrained, and so people have had better access to medicine and food and things like this. Rady says Colombia has a better government. Starting there, we can also add that Colombia has a stronger economy, and issues like corruption are less seen when compared to Venezuela. Interesting. So, could there possibly be a role for the fact that Venezuela is an authoritarian regime, and those institutions present the leaders in Venezuela with a very different set of incentives than, say, the elected leaders in Colombia, where they frankly have to do their best or at least make an effort to govern relatively effectively. Otherwise, they'll be voted out. That's an interesting angle, right? Certainly, there might be some critical differences, not just in economic policies, but also in political institutions and the incentives that they create for the respective leaders. Now, institutions matter a great deal, and Douglas North in economics showed us that. But we also know that it matters from our perspective in political science. I say our because I was trained as a political scientist, but I do think of myself as a political economist. Uh, so there's a role for institutions, not just economic ones, but also political ones. Starting from the very top, Rady says Venezuela's economic decay is the result of the expropriation of private business. So they did expropriate businesses, and in many cases didn't satisfactorily compensate them. I think that the situation might be a little more complicated, but that certainly does undercut political development, right? Because if we define property rights as one component of political development, it's difficult to say that expropriation fits neatly with with political development. Uh, in terms of how the economic crisis and deep humanitarian disaster in Venezuela resulted from those factors, expropriation and economic policy, I think it's complicated. I think that some of those, it's often said that their over reliance on oil was their downfall. Not necessarily. And the reason I say that is because the fact is most of Latin America relies disproportionately on the export of natural resources. And in fact, countries that are even less economically complex and less diversified than Venezuela have not had anything like the disaster that Venezuela has had. And so I just don't feel persuaded by those explanations. Why then did Chile and in Bolivia and Peru, and why did these other places keep it together? And not only that, but why did many of them prosper despite equal reliance on that or some kind of natural resource? You might say that Venezuela relied too disproportionately and was spending too much. That's possible, certainly, but Argentina spends a lot too. I think that there are a variety of factors. Some of these failed policies that we've discussed, failed leadership, the perverse incentives generated by the authoritarian regime, the regime's involvement in the deep corruption, which is also promoted and fostered by the authoritarian institutions, which privilege a narrow inner circle bought off by the Maduro administration. The government's direct involvement in mass organized crime. It's very complicated. The purchasing and the co-optation of the military, despite a half century of civilian control. There's a lot there, and I think it's a picture that does require a nuanced assessment, and that's what the political economy approach permits us to do. We could even think about some of the long-term causes of the outcome in Venezuela. Now, we're getting ahead of ourselves here because in coming weeks, we'll investigate some of those long-term causes by reviewing some theories of development. And that will help us to understand situations like the Venezuelan case a little bit better. But for now, it's useful for us to wet our whistles thinking about some of these issues. Walter says, would the view of trading drugs in Colombia be a benefit? So Colombia is a producer of coca. In fact, Colombia and Bolivia, if I recall correctly, are the only two countries in the world. Oh, Peru too, that can produce coca. And so it is an illicit crop, but it's just the base used in the creation of cocaine. And a lot of peasant farmers make much more that way than they do other drugs or other, excuse me, other commodities. And so I've covered this in other classes, the politics of organized crime and the drug trade as well. And the value of it is no doubt important to regions of the countryside in places like Colombia. And the farmers interviewed will say that they can't make more money producing other commodities. And so while it is illicit, it does, at least at those levels, sustain whole communities. And so far, a lot of the government's policy response, which has been focused on eradicating supply as opposed to changing the incentives of producers, has been insufficient. And so they haven't yet been able to make it more economically viable to produce something else. And it's still illicit. So Colombia, the government's position and their opposition to it doesn't really present opportunities to benefit from it. Although they do, of course, receive money, or they did for a long time from the United States. Rady says that's a valid point, since drug trafficking is also a huge industry. Walter from Adolfo. So maybe there's a critique in policy that may facilitate control and economic stability. I love that you all are thinking in these ways and that you're thinking about how we can critique policy by using comparisons and invoking differences or variations that seem to highlight disparities or seem to highlight the weaknesses of some countries and the strengths of others, at least in the development area that you might be looking at. Is having a policy against drugs holding these countries back? That's a huge question. And oftentimes these policies are motivated deeply by the United States, who's chosen that policy. So we can't really get into it right now because we're actually out of time. But there is certainly an argument to be made that the policies haven't worked and that, other approaches could be beneficial. We can get into that at some other time. It's an interesting topic. We don't know as much about it, but this was a very useful exercise, everyone. I hope that you were okay with the approach that we took today, where we sort of introduced these more abstract concepts and where you kind of try to think through some of the applications. No doubt we'll get into more detail and we'll have examples and we'll be more practical in coming weeks. Although next week and for a while, we will be again focusing on theory and some of the more conceptual sides of development theory and practice. So thanks so much, everybody, for being here. I hope that you had an enjoyable time and have a good weekend. I'll have office hours today, as always, but I'll see you on Monday.
Thank you very much. We'll catch
Thanks.
you on Monday.
Thanks, everybody.